Risk, evidence, and materiality are foundational to doing an audit. Each of these concepts in isolation is critically important, but in order to conduct an audit, we need to know how they work together. Risk, in the broadest definition, is the likelihood something bad happens. Materiality, in the broadest sense, is what number is big enough someone would care about it. Evidence is proof of our claims. So what drives the relationship between them? Let's look at a few examples of risk to see how this works. So what is the relationship between evidence, control risk, and materiality? Well, if we were to change materiality, so reduce the materiality, that means we're going to be looking for smaller and smaller errors. In terms of control risk, if we are starting to look for smaller and smaller errors, the likelihood that the controls meet this new higher threshold is less. So for example, if we were initially said the controls would work as long as they prevented $1 million error, but now we brought it all the way down to 1,000. Our conclusions may change about the controls. So control risk is going to go up. When control risk goes up, we have two choices. We could do test of controls or substantive testing. Remember our evidence buckets, we have to keep that full. The reason why I say we could do test of controls, it may be that the controls are still effective. We just have not tested them enough to rely on them. That's what the PCAOB observes in their inspection reports, is there's insufficient evidence to warrant the conclusions you reached. In the alternative, we could also say it doesn't look like the controls are effective under the new standard, therefore we need to do more substantive testing. So with a private company, we might actually not even bother asking the question, can they be effective? Because the auditor is not required to test controls. They may just conclude it's more cost effective to go there. So changing materiality changes control risk. Changing control risk is going to give us a couple different options on how we're going to change our evidence. Now imagine we start in the other spot. The auditor cannot gather sufficient evidence. It just doesn't exist. There's not the documents. There's something wrong. A person has been fired. Something has happened. If we can't gather sufficient evidence, then we're going to have to increase our control risk. So if we don't have enough evidence, we're going to have to increase our control risk. Now, does changing control risk change the amount of materiality? It doesn't. Just because something is riskier doesn't mean an outside user has a different perception. And as we have already seen, the direct relationship between control risk and evidence from the prior example. If we look at another risk, detection risk. So that's the likelihood the auditor fails to detect a problem. If the auditor changes materiality, that means the auditors can be looking for smaller and smaller errors. So imagine you were looking for loose change in your couch. If you started by saying, I'm going to keep looking for anything at least $1. So I'm looking for bills. And so that's going to lead to a certain strategy. But if I told you you cared about pennies, you're going to have to dig a little deeper. You're going to have to look a little bit more because dollars are going to be pretty easy to find. And so we see a direct relationship as we change materiality. The likelihood we fail to find something is going to be higher. If we change detection risk, meaning we now want to lower detection risk, then we're going to need to gather more evidence. Because a lower detection risk means we need to be more confident that we found everything. Now, the opposite scenario is also true. Imagine we initially were planning on looking for very small errors. So we had a very low materiality. And we talked to our senior, our manager, and they said you could actually raise materiality. In that case, by raising materiality, we can actually lower detection risk. Or if we raise materiality, we can raise the detection risk, meaning as we're looking for bigger and bigger errors, we don't need to be as precise. We can have a little less confidence. We can be a little bit riskier, which is going to need to reduce our evidence. And so when we think about our final major risk factor, audit risk, that's the likelihood that auditor issues a different opinion than what they should. In particular, that the auditor says there are no problems when there are. Well, if we think about it, the same relationships kind of hold. If we change materiality, the likelihood the auditor issued the wrong opinion goes up. So if this goes down, this goes up. Now, what that means is the auditor gathered insufficient evidence. So remember when we talked about audit risk being either planning or achieved, if the audit is complete and we change materiality, then our audit risk is insufficient. So we have sufficient appropriate evidence. So we didn't meet that standard. And so these concepts are kind of intertwining, and they get more and more dancing together as we get complicated problems. But essentially, we can go back to our baseline scenario. As we change materiality, if we reduce materiality, we're going to increase the risk. As we increase the risk, we're going to need more evidence. What really matters is where that evidence comes from. If we can't gather the evidence, we're going to have higher risk. It's not going to change materiality. Now, is there a direct relationship between evidence and materiality? Yeah. If we reduce materiality, we could just shortcut and say, as this goes down, this goes up. And if this goes up, this goes down. And so the reason why I think it's important that we show the direct relationship there is there's a chance that when you do a problem, you're not going to be told anything about risk. You're just going to be told something happened in materiality. What are you going to do about your evidence? And so from a thought exercise, you could go through risk, but it might be faster to just go directly. Today's word of the day, REM, not just a 90s band.